Hi, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Eternalism Weighs In. My name is David, and the title of this podcast is Unmasking Postmormonism and the Faith Crisis Movement. This is Episode 1. Postmormonism has become far more than just the next phase in the faith journey of a disaffected Latter-day Saint, for it has morphed into a faith crisis movement and a growing anti-Mormon culture, wherein broadcasting one's faith crisis and resignation from the Mormon Church across social media platforms is celebrated as a courageous moral act and triumphant outcome. What one must understand is that post-Mormons believe that you cannot simply walk away from Mormonism with a no-harm, no-foul mentality. Why? Because in their minds, a foul has been committed because harm has been done. So much so that post-Mormons believe that it is morally incumbent upon these disaffected Latter-day Saints to muster up enough post-Mormon courage and post-Mormon resentment to speak up and speak out against all the reported historical discrepancies, social justice infringements, and other alleged wrongs of the Mormon Church. And yet this entire post-Mormon faith crisis movement is based upon a faulty premise. That is, that in rejecting Mormonism for post-Mormonism, one is rejecting a biased and fact-suppressing historical narrative for a totally neutral and fact-divulging historical narrative. The sleight of hand is in presenting Mormon historicity as a heavily biased and one-sided historical narrative with a dismal one-star historical authenticity rating, while at the same time presenting its own post-Mormon historicity as a totally unbiased and impartial historical narrative with a sterling 5-star rating. Post-Mormon historicity is not neutral nor impartial, but is itself a heavily biased and one-sided historical narrative. And it is this post-Mormon sleight of hand that needs to be unmasked. Tragically, what disaffected Latter-day Saints are unwittingly succumbing to when giving way to this post-Mormon induced faith crisis is merely the exchanging of a Mormon and one-sided faith-promoting historical narrative for a post-Mormon and equally one-sided faith-pouncing historical narrative. So important is this observation that before moving on, I would like to present up front at least one example of these two one-sided narratives in order to set the stage for all that is coming in this and future episodes. Let's start with the gold plates. Among the foundational truth claims of the Latter-day Saints are the visitation of the angel Moroni and the deliverance of the gold plates to the young prophet Joseph Smith at the hill Cumorah. Mormon historicity presents these foundational truth claims as a one-sided faith-promoting historical narrative, requiring faith in both the existence of a set of gold plates and in the visitation of a heavenly angel. Now let's turn to the lead plates. Among the numerous post-Mormon conjectures are the fraudulent character of the money-digging Joseph Smith and the behind-the-scenes concoction of a set of lead plates. We see then that post-Mormon historicity with this post-Mormon conjecture is equally a one-sided historical narrative also requiring faith in a set of plates. Only in this case a set of fake lead plates rather than gold plates, as well as faith in their supposition of an earthly fraud being pulled off by what they claim to be the charlatan and arch-deceiver Joseph Smith. The historical fact that there are a dozen or more witnesses who testified as to having viewed and handled a set of gold plates, and yet not a single historical witness who ever testified as to having viewed or handled a set of lead plates, is very revealing of the equally one-sided and biased nature of post-Mormonism's historical narrative. This then is but one example of disaffected Latter-day Saints who, in the midst of their faith crisis, have simply exchanged a one-sided and biased historical narrative with gold plates for yet another one-sided and biased historical narrative with lead plates, forgetting that a post-Mormon induced faith crisis is also a leap of faith, wherein one resigns one's church membership and quits church only to end up in another fishbowl with its own religious, cultural, and historical problems. With that having been said, let us turn now to the unmasking of post-Mormonism and this faith crisis movement. The 17th century philosopher George Berkeley, known as Bishop Berkeley, once complained about the philosophers of his day by stating that we have first raised the dust and then complain we cannot see. This insightful observation is also a perfect description of post-Mormonism in general and of the contents of the CES letter in particular, which is not at all interested in historical and religious clarity, but in disparaging Mormonism in 50 to 100 different ways, all the while hoping that the enormity and magnitude of the dust cloud will be evidence enough that all is not well in Mormondom. As Latter-day Saints, we can no longer afford to live in blissful ignorance of our own Mormon historicity, not if we are going to safeguard our families from the duplicity of post-Mormonism's faith-pouncing rhetoric, wherein they insist they are not out to destroy anyone's faith, while they are in the very process of doing that very thing day in and day out. In general, post-Mormonism simply means life after Mormonism, implying that it is not only possible but preferable to put Mormonism behind oneself and move on with one's life, and the sooner the better. With that having been said, if we Latter-day Saints are caught off guard in that we know nothing about John DeLynne's Mormon Stories podcast, or nothing about the contents of the CES letter, or nothing about the Church's response to these troublesome issues in the Gospel Topics essays, or nothing about the past failings of Mormon historicity, or the equally problematic nature of post-Mormon historicity, and if one is totally unaware of what it means to be red-pilled, or of the mental and psychological disturbance associated with cognitive dissonance, or as to how this disturbance leads to a post-Mormon-induced faith crisis, often leading oneself and one's family out of the church. And finally, if one has little or no understanding of the artistry of historicity and all that is involved in gathering historical facts and arriving at an historical narrative, then one is at risk of being caught up within this cloudy mist of darkness or dust storm called post-Mormonism, along with its oncoming faith crisis, all of which means that you, your family, and your loved ones are all in grave danger of being red-pilled. In this episode, we will be presenting the current red pill, blue pill alternative as a classic and tragic example of a false alternative, with the red pill leading to a faith crisis and the blue pill to a state of blissful ignorance. For those unfamiliar with the meaning of being red-pilled or blue-pilled, let me take a moment to explain their original meanings. The term red pill is derived from the 1999 science fiction movie The Matrix, where Neo, played by Keanu Reeves, is presented with a choice. You take the blue pill, the story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill, you stay in Wonderland, and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. The red pill represents knowledge, freedom, and the brutal truth of reality, whereas the blue pill represents falsehood and blissful ignorance. Red pilling someone does not mean that they will suddenly change their mind and embrace the truth. It simply means that you expose them to enough truth that they have no rational or logical way to answer it or deny it. Obviously, to be blue-pilled, falsehood and blissful ignorance, is viewed by all as a bad thing, while to be red-pilled, knowledge, freedom, and the brutal truth of reality, is viewed as a good thing. Unfortunately, this blue-pilling is rhetorically and strategically being attached to Mormonism in general and to Mormon historicity in particular, given its one-sided faith-promoting narrative, suggesting that one is unwittingly embracing falsehoods and living in blissful ignorance, all of which is viewed by post-Mormons as a very bad thing. While the red pilling is rhetorically and strategically being attached to post-Mormonism in general and to post-Mormon historicity in particular, along with its one-sided faith-pouncing narrative, eventuating in a member of the church experiencing a faith crisis, which more often than not leads them out of the church, all of which is viewed by post-Mormons as a very good thing. This blue pill, red pill rhetoric and strategy may be unfair, deceptive, and misleading, but it is nevertheless a very effective way of labeling the good guys and the bad guys before a discussion has even begun. With the advent of the internet, the risk of active Latter-day Saints being red-pilled is almost inevitable. In fact, the question among Latter-day Saints today should not be who is at risk of this post-Mormon red pilling, but rather who is not at risk. The point is, we are all at risk of being red-pilled and being led into a post-Mormon induced faith crisis, including our youth and missionaries, as well as the millennials and entire LDS families. The point is that this post-Mormon red pilling needs to be taken seriously because the inevitable exposure to post-Mormonism and to the faith-pouncing narrative of post-Mormon historicity is only going to increase geometrically. It will be our argument that this blue pill, red pill alternative between blissful ignorance or a faith crisis is both a tragic and false alternative. Tragic because of the spiritual casualties involved, and false because there is a third alternative that needs to be explored and advanced. Rather than this tragic and false alternative between a one-sided faith-promoting historical narrative and a one-sided faith-pouncing historical narrative, what we are arguing for is an impartial and faith-informing historical narrative. We will have a great deal to say about this third alternative, but for now, let us give you an example of what we are referring to in each instance. And for simplicity's sake, let's not get into an argument over whether or not these are the ideal representations of each category. Beginning with Mormon historicity, let us consider George Q. Cannon's work on the life of Joseph Smith the prophet, published in 1886, as representative of a one-sided faith-promoting historical narrative, leading to what post-Mormons insist is blissful ignorance. Now, in turning to post-Mormon historicity, let us consider Fawn M. Brody's work, No Man Knows My History, published 60 years later and in 1946, as representative of an equally one-sided faith-pouncing historical narrative, leading to what post-Mormons celebrate as an oncoming faith crisis. By the way, it is the great disparity between these two historical accounts on the life of Joseph Smith that leads to the cognitive dissonance that we will be discussing in a future episode. Finally, let us consider Richard L. Bushman's work, Joseph Smith, Rough Stone Rolling, again published nearly 60 years later and in 2005, as a good representative of this third alternative that we are looking to explore and advance in the future, of this impartial faith-informing historical narrative that is more concerned with historical authenticity than advancing a particular historical narrative, either pro or con. In episodes 3 and 4, we will have a great deal to say about historicity as a discipline and of historical authenticity as an ideal. But for now, this should give you a good feel for where we are heading in these first episodes and in our attempt to safeguard your family from this post-Mormon induced faith crisis. Think of it this way. Consider 3 bookshelves in your home, with each bookshelf representing a different era in your gospel understandings. The first bookshelf consists of all the collected works of Mormon apologists on Mormon historicity, with its one-sided faith-promoting narrative, which is representative of yesterday's news and a bygone era of blissful ignorance. The second bookshelf consists of all the collected works of Mormon antagonists on post-Mormon historicity, with its equally one-sided but faith-pouncing narrative, which has suddenly become today's breaking news, and which leads, more often than not, to a faith crisis and resignation from the church. For Latter-day Saints, these two contrary and opposing narratives are increasingly becoming even more and more polarizing, as the two sides double down on both their faith-promoting and faith-pouncing narratives. This escalation can only end poorly for both sides. The only sound and viable solution, then, is to turn to a third alternative or bookshelf, which for now is tomorrow's news, in the sense that these works will consist in a neutral and impartial faith-informing narrative, with historical authenticity as its governing principle, rather than advancing a slanted historical narrative, either pro or con. It is only this third alternative that has any hope of de-escalating the arms race and eliminating the cognitive dissonance spoken of earlier. The good news is that more and more Latter-day Saints are awakening to this third alternative or bookshelf, as there are already a small handful of historical works heading in this direction, such as the already mentioned rough stone rolling. The point is that historical authenticity demands a neutral and impartial faith-informing narrative, and yet we Latter-day Saints are only now awakening to this possibility. In this first episode, we have already begun our unmasking of post-Mormonism as a cultural and faith crisis movement, wherein Latter-day Saints stand at risk of being red-pilled, meaning that with the advent of the internet and social media platforms, and whether we like it or not, our families stand at a very real and very high risk of being exposed to a post-Mormon induced faith crisis. We have also argued that this red pill, blue pill alternative is both a tragic and false alternative. Tragic because of the spiritual casualties involved, and false because the alternative between living in blissful ignorance or succumbing to a faith crisis are not the only alternatives. As part of our wrapping this episode up, let us consider this simplified overview and analysis of what we Latter-day Saints should understand as amateur historians when it comes to historicity and the rigors of achieving the ideal of historical authenticity. Think of it this way. Mormon historicity, with its positive and one-sided faith-promoting narrative, is simply an instance of an institution or religion putting its best foot forward to gain converts and maintain a laudable and credible religious profile. Post-Mormon historicity, with its negative and one-sided faith-pouncing narrative, is simply an instance of a cultural movement and agenda intent on presenting Mormon historicity in its worst light by putting Mormonism's worst foot forward. Now consider a third alternative, with the ideal of historical authenticity being taken up by an impartial or neutral third party intent upon presenting neither a faith-promoting nor a faith-pouncing narrative, but rather a faith-informing narrative, and doing this by putting both feet forward. Another way of thinking about this is to think of what takes place when a young couple are courting each other. Obviously, one wants to put one's best foot forward as we set out to glorify our romantic choice in each other's eyes. However, if a parent or friend is dead set against this courtship and will do whatever is necessary to sabotage the relationship, then they will set out to vilify the undesirable party as mercilessly and relentlessly as possible. The cognitive dissonance created by these two polarizing images of a sparkling princess on the one hand or a wretched witch on the other is obvious. At times like this, what is wanted is an impartial or neutral third-party opinion, who will rectify these two opposing and polarizing impressions with a far more authentic and objective evaluation by presenting both the girl's flaws and strengths. No, she doesn't wear glass slippers and travel around in a sparkling carriage, nor does she have a demonic black cat and fly around on a straw broom. But she does have a Band-Aid on her face and travels around town on a motorized scooter. The point in all this is that historians may also set out to either glorify or vilify their subjects, or in the name of historical authenticity, set out to rectify these one-sided and slanted narratives by putting both feet forward, by presenting in this case a faith-informing rather than a faith-promoting or faith-pouncing narrative. It should be noted up front that whenever I speak of a one-sided Mormon historicity, or an equally one-sided post-Mormon historicity, I am simply referring to the biased or positively slanted tendency for Mormons to put their best foot forward in any discussion, publication, or presentation of Joseph Smith and the origins of Mormonism, and for post-Mormons to do the exact opposite by putting Mormonism's worst foot forward, conveying an equally biased, only negatively slanted tendency. Before ending this episode, let us put a plug in for our course on eternalism by encouraging you to visit our website at christianeternalism.org. Mormonism, writes Elder John A. Whitsoe, may be called the philosophy of eternalism. And then he goes on to make a statement that is particularly relevant to this episode on Mormon historicity. He writes, "The gospel, a rational theology, is founded on truth, on all truth. In building a philosophy of life, a man, therefore, cannot say that some truth must be considered and other truth rejected." Elsewhere he writes, to exchange error for truth is the call of Mormonism. We find this latter quote to be particularly relevant when it comes to these episodes on Mormon and post-Mormon historicity and to the rigors of historical authenticity.